Hi, everyone. So let's get into this essay, or rather this book chapter by Alistair MacIntyre. There's a lot going on in this chapter. There's a lot of things that MacIntyre is trying to accomplish here, a lot of different angles that you can take on it. So let's try to boil it down here at the outset. In the first roughly half, a little more than half of the essay, what I mainly see going on is two theses being defended. So the first thesis, I think, is that intelligibility is what creates and sustains the human world. The second thesis basically explains where that intelligibility comes from, and MacIntyre thinks that it comes from reference to narrativity, to human life as a narrative form. So intelligibility creates and sustains the human world, and that intelligibility comes from narrative, or narrative is where we find it, where we create it. So what do we mean, first of all, by this notion of intelligibility? This is a fancy-sounding philosophical word that's familiar to philosophers, but might not be familiar to you. That basically means meaning-making, as we can understand it. Intelligibility is the potential to be understood, the potential to convey meaning or to have significance. There's a distinction you could make here. Imagine that you are in a foreign country and you're listening to two people speak a foreign language that you don't know, right? What's the difference between that experience and the experience of just sitting next to a couple of ducks on a lake, right? Seeing a couple of ducks quack at each other on a lake. There's a fundamental difference in that even though you don't understand what the two people in the foreign language are saying, you recognize that there's intelligibility being exchanged. You recognize something specifically human that's going on there. Some kind of human exchange of meaning is going on, which you can't recognize in the world of the ducks. Even if you think that they might be, telling each other where there are some good fish or something like that, even if you think there is some meaning being exchanged, there is no potential for you to penetrate that meaning. In the case of the two people who are speaking a foreign language, you know that you could potentially learn that language, you could potentially communicate with them, you can probably communicate with them in other ways through kind of hand gestures and things like that. You recognize them as human because of their power to signify, because of their power to make intelligible statements, even if you can't personally understand those statements. So this is what I think MacIntyre means in part when he says that the primary or most important distinction for us as humans is the distinction between us and other kinds of creatures, the distinction between humans and other kinds of beings in the universe. And as we've seen so far, as I've mentioned at least, different philosophers, it's always been a major question for philosophers, how exactly do we define the human? How do we distinguish the human from other kinds of creatures? Aristotle, of course, said this because we're rational. You get different answers throughout history. This is a different way of answering that question that maybe doesn't try to give a definitive answer as Aristotle was trying to do, but does make some sense for us. The human world is something that is separate from the rest of the world because we create it as such through our creation of and manipulation of meaningfulness, intelligibility, right? Through our ability to mean something to each other. There's also a connection I wanted to draw here with the social contract, and don't read too much into this. This is really just an example of the way that when you place a couple of texts in a certain order, there are always interesting continuities that emerge, different perspectives that they kind of reveal about each other. The social contract is also about, in a certain way, the separation between the human world and what is on its edges, whatever is on the other side of it. So the civil society and the state of nature in Rousseau's terms. We talked a bit about the kind of methodological ambiguities involved in what exactly Rousseau is trying to do. Well, there are some ways in which MacIntyre here preserves that distinction between the kind of civil world, the human world, properly speaking, and what is outside of it, which is generally thought of as the natural world. Whatever you think of as nature, it's usually put in opposition to the human. So the human world and the natural world, for MacIntyre, are not separated so much by history or by this kind of metaphysical contractual agreement as by human meaningfulness, by the world of human signification. There are there's evidence for this precisely in the ways that it can break down. And MacIntyre says in here that intelligibility can break down the intelligibility of a conversation between two people, which of course he also says is the basic form of human transactions, can break down. The intelligibility of one's own life can break down. The intelligibility that sustains a community's set of values, principles, laws can break down. He gives a kind of funny example of this of the guy sitting at the bus stop. There are other examples of this that show up directly in our society, right? So why do we make a distinction between, in a court of law, someone who has committed a crime rationally and in full sanity, and someone who has committed a crime out of insanity? Why do we say that the latter person has deserves a lesser punishment or a different kind of punishment from the person who committed the crime rationally? Well, because that latter person has shown themselves or is trying to prove themselves in that court to be convincingly outside of the human world of signification, to be incapable of the kind of accomplishment of intelligibility and the kind of going along with the rules of civil society that intelligibility entails, right? Their actions are literally unintelligible, and therefore we can't assign responsibility or accountability, to use the term that MacIntyre uses that I'll get to later, to their actions. So in that sense, the insane, and MacIntyre uses this example too, represent a kind of borderland of the intelligible world or of the human world. You can also point to lots of ways in which the exclusion or the oppression of peoples within society is enforced through their exclusion from structures of intelligibility, right? There is privilege and power dynamics that go along with all of this as well. But that's enough for the first thesis. The first thesis, again, of MacIntyre is just being that the human world is created and sustained and separated ultimately from the state of nature, if you want to think about it that way, by intelligibility. So where does that intelligibility come from? MacIntyre tells us and spends a fair amount of this essay trying to prove the point that it comes from the structure of narrative, from the fact that we as humans can only understand each other, can only in fact relate to each other, and can only understand ourselves intelligibly, again, by reference to larger narratives in which we participate, which we create by our actions. If you'll refer briefly to the handout that I put online, which is in the content collection section, I gave you a couple of visual aids that I'll usually put on the blackboard in class when I'm teaching this, to hopefully make a little bit of sense of what he's saying here. The second one, first of all, maybe we should focus on is my kind of representation of the structure of an action in MacIntyre's terms. An action, he says, necessarily involves some reference to a larger narrative, and that reference in the particular instance of an action takes the form of the attribution of intention. So this is the point of the funny story of the guy at the bus stop, right, is that he finds himself incapable of simply accepting that the person next to him has no reason for saying what he's saying. He finds it unacceptable that the person he's talking to just has no narrative that he is enacting, and so the person has to begin projecting narratives onto him, trying to establish intentions. So intentions link individual actions to larger narratives. Right, to say I did this for this particular reason is to say that there's a grander narrative made up of a whole sequence of actions that I am trying to meaning intending to enact, that I'm trying to make real. Right? So MacIntyre thinks that our ability to sustain meaning, our ability to share meaning, and our ability to understand ourselves meaningfully comes from this narrative structure of human life, and that it's our understanding of ourselves and each other in terms of intention which ultimately generates those narratives. All right. That's plenty for now. I'll have more to say about MacIntyre in the near future. Thank you.